Imagine an American waking up on an ordinary morning, walking into a British cafe, and ordering what they assume will be a simple breakfast. A few minutes later, a plate arrives so full that it looks like it was prepared to feed an entire family. Eggs, bacon, sausages, baked beans, mushrooms, tomatoes, and toast. For many British people, this is perfectly normal. But for many Americans, there is an obvious question. Why would anyone eat all of that first thing in the morning? The famous full English breakfast is more than just a heavy meal. It is connected to British history, working-class traditions, and the daily routines of an industrial society. And the strangest part is that some of the ingredients that seem completely out of place on an American breakfast plate are precisely what make this meal so iconic in Britain. The culture shock becomes even greater when the baked beans appear. For an American, beans at breakfast might already seem unusual, but they are not necessarily impossible to understand. The real surprise comes when those beans are placed next to eggs, bacon, and sausages, creating a combination that challenges the way many people think breakfast should work. In the United States, breakfast often leans toward pancakes, waffles, cereal, or toast with something sweet. In Britain, however, the first meal of the day can sometimes feel more like an early lunch, but this is only the beginning. There is another British food that is even more controversial, one that can leave Americans wondering how anyone ever decided that these ingredients belong together in the first place. And perhaps that combination of ingredients explains why the full English breakfast remains so popular. It was never designed to be a delicate or minimalist culinary experience. It was meant to be filling, substantial, and capable of keeping someone going for hours. Today, you can find it in hotels, cafes, and pubs, and modern versions sometimes try to make it more sophisticated, but the basic idea remains the same. To an American, seeing that much food first thing in the morning can be shocking. To a British person, it can represent tradition, comfort, and even nostalgia. But once we move on to the next dish, the conversation changes completely, because some foods are simply unusual, while others make you seriously wonder who came up with the idea in the first place. Now imagine a pie that, from the outside, looks completely ordinary. A golden, crispy crust that seems harmless enough. But when you cut into it, you discover a filling made with meat, thick gravy, and ingredients that transform a simple pie into an entire meal. This is when many Americans begin to realize that British cuisine has a very particular relationship with the idea of putting almost anything inside pastry. Savory pies are an important part of British food culture, and some of them have become so popular that they have moved far beyond home kitchens and restaurants to become cultural symbols. The interesting part is that, for someone raised in a completely different food culture, some of these combinations can be difficult to understand at first. One particularly surprising example is steak and kidney pie, traditionally made with beef and kidney cooked in a rich gravy. For many Americans, the simple presence of kidney is enough to make the dish feel completely unfamiliar. In the United States, organ meats have not generally maintained the same place in everyday cuisine that they historically held in parts of Britain. But there is a reason behind this tradition. For centuries, using different parts of an animal was not simply a culinary preference, it was an economic necessity. Ingredients that might seem unusual today were once valuable, because wasting food was simply not an option. That tradition of making use of the entire animal can still be seen in several British dishes that surprise people from other countries. But there is something even more interesting about these foods. British cuisine often has a remarkable ability to turn simple and inexpensive ingredients into incredibly comforting meals. The combination of pastry, meat, and gravy might sound heavy, but on a cold, rainy day, there is a reason why these dishes remain popular. They are warm, filling, and deeply connected to memories of home. And perhaps that is why many Americans, after getting past the initial surprise, begin to understand the appeal. But there is still another category of British food waiting for us. One that can create a completely different reaction. The kind of dish that looks like one thing, sounds like another, and tastes like something you never expected. There is an unwritten rule that many people learn as children. Dessert is sweet, and savory food is salty. It seems obvious, right? Well, British cuisine has a habit of challenging that assumption. Some traditional dishes can completely confuse people who are unfamiliar with British food culture, especially when the name of a dish does not match what you expect to find on the plate. One of the best examples is the famous Yorkshire pudding. Despite the name, it is not a dessert in the way many Americans might imagine. Instead, it is a baked batter traditionally served alongside roast meat and gravy. For an American who hears the word pudding and immediately imagines a sweet, creamy dessert, the discovery can be genuinely confusing. And the confusion does not come only from the taste. The word pudding itself has a much broader meaning in British English and can refer to different types of traditional preparations, including desserts and savory dishes. This means that when an American hears a particular name, they may immediately create an image in their mind that is completely different from what a British person expects. The result can lead to some hilarious cultural misunderstandings. It is almost as if the two sides are looking at the same plate while using completely different culinary dictionaries. And just when you think you have finally figured out how the system works, another British classic appears and completely changes the rules again. This relationship between names, appearance, and flavor reveals something fascinating about British cuisine. Many traditional dishes are deeply connected to local history and were never designed to be immediately understood by foreigners. They evolved over generations, within communities where everyone already knew exactly what to expect. That is why, when someone from another country tries them for the first time, there can be a genuine cultural shock. But perhaps no dish captures this feeling better than a food that, depending on who is looking at it, could be mistaken for a dessert, a meat dish, or even some kind of culinary accident. And that brings us to one of the most comforting combinations in British food culture. Now imagine an incredibly simple plate: mashed potatoes, sausages, and gravy. At first glance, it sounds like something that could exist in countless countries. But in Britain, this combination has developed its own identity and become one of the best examples of classic comfort food. The famous bangers and mash might seem too simple to be surprising, but there is a reason people love it. The dish represents an important characteristic of British cooking: the ability to transform ordinary ingredients into a meal that creates an immediate feeling of comfort. For many Americans, the strange part is not necessarily the ingredients themselves, but the way they are combined and served, especially when the entire plate is covered with a generous amount of rich gravy. The word bangers, used to describe the sausages, also has an interesting history. The nickname became associated with sausages that, particularly during periods when meat was scarce, could contain a higher proportion of water and would sometimes burst or bang when cooked at high temperatures. Over time, the name remained even as recipes changed. It is a small detail like this that shows how food can preserve pieces of a country's history without people even realizing it. When someone eats a traditional dish, they may actually be repeating customs that began decades or even centuries earlier. And that is one reason why certain British foods remain so popular. They are not simply meals, but small pieces of cultural memory. But there is an even more interesting question. While some British dishes have become famous around the world, others are still viewed with suspicion by people who grew up outside the United Kingdom. And when we reach our final example, we enter territory where the appearance, texture, and even the historical origins of the food can trigger an immediate reaction. It is the kind of dish that makes you stop and ask, is this really food? To understand why it still exists today, however, we have to look beyond the flavor and go back in time. Because the final food on this list may be the one that best reveals how two cultures can look at the exact same ingredient and see something completely different. We have finally arrived at one of the dishes that best represents the cultural gap between British and American food traditions: jellied eels. For many Americans, the first reaction to this combination is disbelief. Eel is already an uncommon ingredient in the everyday diet of many people in the United States, but serving it surrounded by savory jelly seems to take the idea to an entirely different level. The dish became especially associated with London's East End, where eels were once relatively accessible and abundant. Preparing them in this way helped create a preserved food with a distinctive texture that was completely different from what many people would expect from fish. To someone looking at it from the outside, the dish can seem almost impossible to explain. But to understand why it exists, you have to remember that traditional cuisine is often born from necessity, availability, and the ingredients people had access to at the time. And this may actually be the key to understanding all of these foods. Many recipes that seem strange today were not created to impress tourists or become viral sensations on the internet. They were created because people needed to make the most of available ingredients, feed their families, and find practical ways to preserve food. Over generations, those practical solutions became traditions. That is why one person can look at a British dish and think that the combination makes absolutely no sense, while another person sees a childhood memory, a family tradition, or a connection to a specific place. In that sense, food is almost like a language. You might not understand it immediately, but once you learn the story behind it, everything starts to make a little more sense. In the end, perhaps the real question is not which of these foods is strange, but why they seem strange to some people and completely normal to others. The breakfast with baked beans, the pie filled with unexpected ingredients, the Yorkshire pudding that is not actually a dessert, sausages with mashed potatoes and gravy, and even eels trapped in jelly are all products of a very specific cultural history. And there is an irony in all of this. There are probably American foods that seem just as confusing to a British person. After all, when two cultures meet, the other person's food almost always looks a little strange. And perhaps that is exactly what makes food so fascinating. Because in the end, exploring another country's cuisine is about much more than discovering new flavors. It is about discovering how another culture understands tradition, necessity, memory, and even what it means to enjoy a good meal.